It's time for the Bible Geek. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, fantastic, God, blast them on the spot. Ghost, yes, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek. Interpretation, startle, Jesus, homiletical, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Bible Geek here. I'll be away for a few days of the Lovecraft Convention, the Necronomicon, so I wanted to make sure I got one more geek in beforehand. I guess I'll be home Tuesday. I'll try to do another one then, but in the meantime, once again, let me take hat in hand and like a Buddhist mendicant ask, brother, can you spare a dime for my creditors here? After all, this is how the Bible Geek makes his pittance of a living. Anyway, let's get on to those darn questions. This from... wait a minute, where's the name? Oh, Dennis Lecker. Okay, thank you, Dennis. I'm a 40-something educational technologist who's, go ahead and call yourself a technologian, whose passions include philosophy and the study of myth. My bio entails one who was raised Catholic, lost his faith, and began to study and practice the Buddhist writings of D.T. Suzuki. I'm having trouble seeing through my glasses here. Sweating and this humidity doesn't help. Okay, Shunryu Suzuki and Thich Nhat Hanh. Thereafter I regained my Christianity through the bullying tactics of the Navigators, or the Nirvana-gators, and Campus Crusade. That is, you're gonna burn forever if you don't believe, and so on, before moving to El Salvador and plunging headlong into the teachings and writings of Baha'u'llah, Abdul-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi. I ate this stuff up like chocolate-covered raisins. If there weren't any raisins, I'd join you. Yeah, I love the Baha'i faith and Buddhism. Upon my return to the States and in my early 30s, I was actively recruited by the Catholic Church and found my person singing Vespers with the monks at St. Vincent's in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. That sounds pretty neat. However, after rereading the philosophy of Epicurus and the poems of Lucretius, I was motivated to follow a path of skepticism which led to Gorgias, Epicurus, Lucretius, Omar Khayyam, Bacon, Hobbes, John Stuart Mill, Bertrand Russell, culminating in an extensive and intense meditation as to the YouTube debates and speeches of Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, Harris, Lawrence Krauss et al., as well as the deconstruction of Derrida. Do I hear applause somewhere? Needless to comment, all of the previous has led to an interest in the thoughts of the Bible Geek. Holy mackerel, from the sublime to the ridiculous. Now that I've gotten my tedious biography out of the way, by no means, I have two questions for you. In the minds of many Christians, the fundamental premise of their belief is that the Christ figure is a literal scapegoat through which human transgressions are nullified. Furthermore, this belief seems to derive from the ritual of Yom Kippur's sacrificial goat. As you seem to be adept at separating the practicality of religious tradition from misconceptions thereof, I ask, how could such a practice or belief be understood as something other than an immoral passing of the proverbial buck or a vicarious redemption? I've been wondering that for years. For many years, as a Christian, I just took for granted that his blood washes away our sins and all that stuff. Or, similar idea, he died for your sins, he was punished for your crimes. I gotta say that neither one of these strikes me as meaningful. They both presuppose ancient conceptualities that we reject not simply because they're passé or old, but because they seem to violate the most common axioms of justice. I think of one great treatment of this is in a 19th century work called A Treatise on the Atonement by Hosea Ballou, the second founder of Universalism. And in it, he says he was much influenced by Ethan Allen's book, Reason, the Only Oracle of Man. Allen was a deist and a rationalist. Ballou was a Christian universalist, but with a heavy rationalist influence, and he said, look, as for the substitutionary atonement, or a penal substitution in that variety of it, so suppose some guy was trying to assassinate the president and was nabbed before he could carry it through. He's jailed, he's about to hang, and imagine the president suddenly rushes to the gallows and says, no, hang me instead. Huh? What the heck is supposed to be going on there? How could anybody consider that just? I mean, let's not confuse it with the idea of some, like, what does the Gospel of John say? Greater love has no man than this, to give up his life for the sake of his friends. That's a whole different shooting match, right? This is the president, who is innocent, and against whom this crime was committed. He's willing to say, no, let this guilty skunk go and punish me for what he did. It just seems utterly absurd. How is that justice? Tillich speaks of grace as creative justice, but that's a bit different. There's alternatives and so forth, but this? Oh yeah, it's got to be taken out of somebody's hide. That's for sure. But how about that of the innocent person rather than the guilty one? What the heck? That's justice? Or even weirder is this propitiation thing where my sins, and really they're talking about ritual infractions, they are dealt with by passing them on to a stupid animal who can't have committed any sin. You're going to, as you say, pass the buck to him, and he's going to be, his blood will be shed, and that will wash away your sins. I mean, come on. What sense does that make? It's just some ancient magical thing. And of course, more modern theologians have had a heck of a time with this, like D.M. Bailey in his nonetheless great book, God Was in Christ, where he's trying to come up with some believable, some plausible mechanism, but what he comes up with is kind of similar to Abelard's what the heck is it? The moral influence theory, that the sufferings of the incarnate God on the cross are really just sort of a writ large version of the pain that it engenders to try to forgive somebody for a terrible thing. That, get out of here. I mean, that's just touchy-feely gibberish. What are you talking about? And how can God feel such pain if God is an imperturbable being and all this stuff? Come on. It just doesn't work. So I think that it's just based on crude and alien conceptuality that no one would espouse or accept if it weren't part of this theological package, and it'd be better to dump it. I once did a sermon called The Cross of Christ, the Grace of God. I said if you take a Bultmann demythologizing approach, everywhere you see the cross of Christ in the Bible, you could just substitute the grace of God. That doesn't imply any kind of weird metaphysical shell game. It just means that God is forgiving. But, is that too much of a reduction? I guess I kind of think it is now, and I don't find that helpful even. Let's see. Okay, my second question includes the Urban Dictionary's definition of Christianity, that is, the rib woman, talking snake, Jewish zombie thing, etc. I ask, wouldn't such a satirical and disrespectful description of a faith system work well with regard to debating men like William Lane Craig? As Craig and his ilk usually begin their debates by creating straw men using hyperbole and asking ridiculous questions such as, is atheism true? Would not a constant reference to the illogical nature of Christianity as exemplified in the Urban Dictionary description of Christianity be quite effective, albeit highly offensive in terms of reducing a sincere belief to a ridiculous superstition, as so nicely exemplified in Monty Python's Life of Brian and the Meaning of Life? Let's see, Dennis. I bristle at things like that. Madeline Murray O'Hare used to say that. Sometimes Richard Dawkins, I think, oversimplifies Christian doctrines in an insulting straw man way. I know he's thinking, well, this is what it amounts to, but you ain't gonna win any friends or influence any people with that approach. I would like to see people attack the illogical character of things like the Atonement. Like, how do you think this is justice? That I would like to see, but blistering ridicule, that seems to me to be ineffective and pointlessly nasty. Plus, I have to admit, I think some of these things wind up not being the bottom line, not being a reductio ad absurdum, but an insulting oversimplification. I tend to think, like with transubstantiation, Richard Dawkins, who of course I like, and he's great and brilliant. I once heard him say that the idea of Holy Communion or transubstantiation is that an ancient rabbi turned himself into a cracker. And I'm sorry, but P.Z. Myers once said, well, I got a communion host here. I'm going to nail it into the wall and see if it bleeds. These guys obviously do not understand what any of the Christian versions of transubstantiation, consubstantiation, representationalism, etc. are. There's some sophisticated thinking that went into these definitions. Now, I don't have a dog in the race. I don't believe it, but I must admit that some very imaginative, sincere, and sometimes even profound thinking went into this stuff, as I would with Sufism, with Buddhist metaphysics. I don't have to accept the conclusion, but I don't wind up agreeing with Plato, though of course he was infinitely smarter than I'll ever be. But I admire what he's saying. Bishop Barclay, Leibniz, these guys were brilliant, even if you don't wind up agreeing with them, and I think insulting caricatures just don't help, because I think that's what they are, straw men, and oversimplifying doesn't help the debate because you're not debating what anybody actually thinks. So, good question. Martin Squires says, Smarticus here, long time no talk. I've been trying to post questions over the past year or so from time to time, but they never seem to come up in the shows. I would post a question, listen to the subsequent episode, and then hear the dreaded "the rain barrel is empty." So I'm trying this email in the hope it gets through. Yeah, I don't know what's going on there, because I always have them forwarded to me if they come through Mindvendor and all of that, and I'm pretty good about saving and copying the question, so I don't know what's going on there. But then again, I've got the Stupanatron helmet on. What do I know? Sorry about that. I've been cloistered for nearly 2 years studying ancient Near Eastern history and archaeology, mostly to get a bigger picture. The more I discover, the more I need to discover. But I am trying to catch up on the Bible Geek show and and to my less familiar subject area of the New Testament. So my question, just for starters, a nice easy one, what novels would you recommend that deal with a critical take on the Bible? I know you discussed this a long time back, and I would welcome a refresher. Well, one that my old mentor David Scholler suggested to me was The Promise by Chaim Potok, which deals with this young man trying to make his way to ordination as a rabbi, but he says the Talmud and all that stuff is much more understandable if you apply textual criticism to it, and the old rabbis were having none of that. And Scholler rightly said this is going to show you all the clearer, because it's in a different framework than yours, you Christian seminarians, what the issues are with seeing the higher, or in that case, the lower criticism as an important tool when others see it as blasphemy. So I think that would be a good one. Also, I got to shamelessly plug my own screed, my book, Secret Scrolls, Revelations from the Lost Gospel Novels, where I deal with over 40 of these things and show how correctly or incorrectly they depict biblical criticism and the larger social issues of what's going to happen if some discovery debunks Christian orthodoxy or has it already. So I think you'd get a big kick out of that. There are, again, over 40 of these novels that are dealing with it, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly. Thank you, Smarticus. All right, who is up next? This is Nico, he of the Serpent in Eden. He says, hello again, just wrapping up my trip here in the Nameless City, Lovecraft story. They really need to revisit that slogan at the tourist board. The Tetrapodophis Amplectus are so adorable, they should make this the Hugging Snake City. Well, I'm a Lovecraftian, and even I don't get it. Okay, as with my previous missive, please feel free to put this aside or pare it down to just the bits that seem interesting. I completely forgot in my previous overlong email about snakes to mention why Adam's curse was snake-related. Once again, this is the conflation between snakes and worms. Snakes live on, or hunt in burrows and eat the dust of the earth, and so on. So once again, they were considered part of the same general family as worms. While snakes aren't farmers, so it seems strange to us, worms do farm. In a way, or at least they dig for their meals, and frankly, the ancients had many nonsensical folk beliefs about animals, so they may have believed that snakes did sometimes eat dirt. Basically, the curse was probably originally some version of, you want to be like us, kid? Okay, union rules then. Start digging, son. And there you have it. Of course, there's the fact that so many other things in the forest are poisonous too, as I mentioned, which probably plays into the curse with snake poison. But that didn't explain why Adam specifically had to dig. You notice he was not sentenced to hunt or fish or gather mushrooms and berries. Interesting what is left out. This will surely be where I wrap up this theorizing of mine in spite of the deja vu. I'm sure this is my last. Thanks again for your attention. You betcha, Nico. Good luck with developing your thesis further. This from Lachlan. This is a pop culture question rather than a Christianity and antiquity question. Reading Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, that's what Blade Runner was based on. Near the end, Mercer is shown to be a myth, played by an actor whose ordeal is taking place on a sound stage, not an actual person in an actual desert. Yet the experience of Mercerism is a valid, even miraculous experience of the Numinous. Was this a reflection of a Christian atheist trend happening at that time? Or am I simply reading in a parallel that isn't actually a parable or parallel? I don't know what you mean. I wish I were more familiar with the source material. It would also make a difference as to when he wrote, because Christian atheism was really a product of the middle of the 60s. If he was writing then, I don't know about that novel, but it could be. But it almost seems to me to be a kind of paranoid Gnosticism, and sort of like a Truman Show kind of thing, that there is a God, but he's sort of playing tricks on us. But I think you're zeroing in on the idea of a divine sort of religious experience, even without an ontological reference point. And I think that would fit Death of God theology, because once you realize that these experiences come from the temporal parietal lobe, or whatever the heck it is, and can be induced magnetically and all that, that still does not mean it's worthless, right? You can still consider a transcendent experience to be transformative and edifying without thinking that it's an experience of somebody outside of your head. I think you can go into it eyes open and treasure this experience, and that is that's like Don Cupid and Christian non-realism, which I think is a viable option. Let's see, Jorby here with a need of some textual healing, as you say. I've been doing my homework, scouring the book of Zechariah, which was purportedly written when Israel was captive, as part of my study of Matthew, because if you haven't studied Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi, you haven't studied the Gospels at all. Yeah, you're certainly right about Zechariah, especially with Matthew. That's my cue to get to the point of this email. This is from the American Standard Bible. Hallelujah. Zechariah 2:10 through 3:8. Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for lo, I come, and I will dwell in the midst of thee, saith Jehovah. And many nations shall join themselves to Jehovah in that day, and shall be my people. And I will dwell in the midst of thee, and thou shalt know that Jehovah of hosts has sent me unto thee. And Jehovah shall inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and shall yet choose Jerusalem. Be silent, all flesh, before Jehovah, for he is waked up out of his holy habitation. And he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of Jehovah, and Satan standing at his right hand to be his adversary. And Jehovah said unto Satan, Jehovah rebuke thee, O Satan. Yea, Satan that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Huh? Now, what am I doing? Yea, Jehovah that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments, and was standing before the angel. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take the filthy garments from off him. And unto him he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with rich apparel. And I said, Let them set a clean mitre upon his head. So they set a clean mitre upon his head, and clothed him with garments. And the angel of Jehovah was standing by. And the angel of Jehovah protested unto Joshua, saying, Thus saith Jehovah of hosts, if thou wilt walk in my ways, and if thou wilt keep my charge, then thou also shalt judge my house, and shall also keep my courts, the temple, right? And I will give thee a place of access among these that stand by, the priests. Hear now, O Joshua, the high priest, thou and thy fellows that sit before thee, for they are men that are a sign For behold, I will bring forth my servant the branch. And now for some questions. How many angels are presented to us in this scene? Let's see. I think that there's been there is a need for textual healing, as you say, because it seems clear to me that some copyist left out an initial occurrence of the angel of Jehovah. Because how the heck is Jehovah himself saying, Jehovah rebuke you? It seems clear to me that it's the angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, on the one hand, defending Joshua, and the Satan, the adversary, on the other, accusing him, the accuser of our brethren, etc. And that it's the angel of has simply dropped out at one point, an easy copyist error to make. So I think there's just the one. 2. Is it possible that Zechariah 3:1 is using one of those famous doublets and that the angel of Jehovah is Satan? Zechariah 3:1, and he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of Jehovah, and Satan standing at his right hand to be his adversary. So could that be like even Satan standing at his right hand to be his adversary? I don't see any need for that, since we do go on to see interaction between the Satan and the angel of Yahweh. So I think that's, I suppose, a possible but improbable reading of that. 3. In the Geek's interpretation of these verses, who is the speaker that answers Jehovah? Zechariah 3:2-4. And Jehovah said unto Satan, Jehovah rebuke thee, O Satan. Yea, Jehovah that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this, that is Joshua, a brand plucked out of the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments, and was standing before the angel. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take the filthy garments from off him. And unto him he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with rich apparel. Once again, who spoke? Satan? Once again, I'd say that is supposed to be the angel of Jehovah, though he does, toward the end, speak much like Adonai in the temple in Isaiah 6, where he, though isn't it and I think it's the angel. Let's see, in Isaiah 6. Okay, you're hiding from me. Chapter 6. Yeah. Isaiah 6:6. Then flew one of the seraphim to me, having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth, and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin forgiven. Okay, so that's, I think that just really secures the idea that in Zechariah, it's the angel of Jehovah speaking to him, and that it's there's this confusion because somebody's left out the angel of. 4. Did Satan just cause Joshua's iniquity to pass from him? No, again, I think that's the angel of Yahweh absolving him of sinfulness, just like the seraph does in Isaiah 6. 5. Does Satan have the ability to forgive sins? I don't think so, because he's the accuser. And keep in mind that, well, of course, there is one theology, that of the Seventh-day Adventists, and presumably therefore believed by Dr. Ben Carson, that, not that I'm criticizing him, I like him, where he... where they say that Satan is Azazel, the scapegoat, and that he bears away the sins that Christ has forgiven, which really gets evangelicals freaking out. I think they've since tried to get rid of that doctrine, but who knows. Let's see. Okay, Jorby again. 6. Joshua was noted as a brand plucked out of the fire. Would that be the fires of hell? Or is it the fire of Zechariah 2:5? For I, saith Jehovah, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and I will be the glory in the midst of her. I think it's the same sort of thing we read. I think it's in Jude, isn't it? Where Paul McCartney writes, come on now. Jude often hides right before the book of Revelation. In Jude verses 22 through 23. Remember, there's only one chapter in Jude, so you always refer to it simply by verse. And convince some who doubt, save some by snatching them out of the fire, and on some have mercy with fear, hating even the garment spotted by the flesh. Well, that actually seems to me to be based on this passage in Zechariah. And the idea is that it's like somebody rescued from a burning house. And only the specific image is like a log in the fire. Before it's consumed, maybe you can yank it out of there. And I think that's all that really means. I don't see any reason to bring Tophet or Gehenna into it. Which wouldn't make much sense anyway, since the idea was that Molech, the god who lived in that fiery underworld, devoured sacrificed babies, and that's about it. That's all we know about him. Let's see. Let's see here. Yeah, not really a question, but if it is Satan, then it does call back Satan trying Job, and although it was quite cruel of God and Satan to murder Job's family, he got new kids and even more stuff than he could that he could never enjoy as much as his beloved kids. Well, yeah, that is the idea, that he's the accuser. Turns out there's really nothing wrong with Job, right? He just wants God. It's a bet. The Satan says, I can't help thinking this mortal is making a fool of you, O Lord, because you look at the fringe benefits you give him. He'd be a fool not to worship you. If you took away that motivation, you'd find out where he's really at, and so he allows him to do that, and it turns out good old Job is tried and true. Same sort of a thing here. There's some sort of political mess going on here in Judah, and there are accusations against Joshua. Should he be given the office of high priest? And critics were saying, no, look at the guy, look at what he's done, he's corrupt. Who knows what was actually going on? But Zechariah is in his corner, and he says, well, I can't really deny that he's got some problems, but I happen to know that the angel of Yahweh appeared and okayed him. He has purified him, so he's the man for the job. 7. Have you found other translations of Zechariah 2:10 verses 3:8 a bit more clear as to the identity of the angel? Now, to me, it all hinges on that we're dealing, that there's a copyist error. At least I think there must have been. That it said the angel of Yahweh in the beginning, and so he is the one referred to later. There's not a new angel introduced. 8. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? I believe Aquinas said any number of them, because they don't have weight or mass. They don't take up space. 9. Where does the question of how many angels condensed in the head of a pin even come from Aquinas? Is it, I mean, he didn't put it quite that way, but he did deal with pretty much the same issue, referring to angels, and he's just trying to illustrate how, as he understands them, angels are pure spirits and do not have mass, even though they may appear that way for the sake of humans, but that would be docetic, right, which is okay to say about angels. Right, the Christian orthodoxy just says it's not the case with Jesus. Jesus was the divine incarnate. Angels are not. Call them holograms or holygrams, whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Like Raphael in the Book of Atonement. 10. Zechariah 2:13. Be silent, all flesh, before Jehovah, for he has waked up out of his holy habitation. In Zechariah 3:4, Zechariah requests that a lovely hat be placed on Joshua's head. Might this have been a dream because Zechariah disobeyed and spoke before God without being killed or having his cable TV privileges taken away? You know, I've always been pretty convinced that that's what John the Baptist was griping about in his cell at Herod Antipas's fortress. You know, no cable TV, come on. Though Jesus later tells us that Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, was killed by the priest between the altar and the sanctuary. It's in Matthew 23:35. It's not clear he's talking about the same guy. There's some reason to think, as Edgar Goodspeed suggested, that he's really talking about a Zechariah who was killed in the same circumstances in the run-up to the war with Rome, and that it's an anachronism. But the whole thing is a vision, that's for sure, a waking dream. And so he's the headdress is the turban of the high priest. Okay, thanks, Jorby. Interesting stuff. You do have a sharp eye. Let's see. I speaking of copyist errors, I think this is from Mitchell from France, but it's possible I mistranscribed this and it's Michel. I don't know. Anyway, oh, rightly guided geek. I have not yet put the finishing touches on my religious biography for you to read on air. However, I would like to quickly share a very good video series on the topic of hell. In your July 10th podcast, a listener asked for good written resources on the subject. A short but informative work is the now 102-year-old The Christian Hell by Hypatia Bradlaugh Bonner, an early 20th century British atheist woman. Yeah, I think I've read that book. That is a goodie. She was born in 1958, the daughter of Charles Bradlaugh, founder of the National Secular Society. The book, now in the public domain and available at archive.org, is short, well-written, and there's something inherently interesting in having a chance to see the attitude of a writer removed from us by a century. By chance, a reading of it exists on YouTube. The channel Bawd to Bits, that is capital B-A-U-D, number 2, capital B-I-T-S, has a full audio rendering of it with a very soothing voice, complete with page scans and occasional illustrative pictures. The series is simply called The Christian Hell, and each chapter lasts from 5 to 20 minutes. It covers the evolution of the concept from early Palestine to the 19th century, taking time to explore the musings of various Christian authors. It is not a very academic work, but it is quite an entertaining one and a good summing up of 2 millennia of attitudes toward the lake of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth from the point of view of important theologians as well as popular culture and attitudes. Thank you. I recommend that. I'm sure all Bible Geek listeners would get a huge kick out of it. John Brockman. To carry on from one of my previous questions, Hellenistic versus Jewish Gospels, I've gotten the impression, either from Richard Carrier or David Fitzgerald or both, that the early proto-Christian movement was a mishmash of odd little sects and faiths scattered all over the Mediterranean, and because there wasn't an actual historical Jesus, but rather a series of myths culled from Jewish tradition and surrounding religions, there wasn't actually a core that these cultlets were founded on. Thus, once you discard the historical Jesus and begin working from this perspective, doesn't this make for an easier, better justified, and even better critical position to work from? Why try to square the circle and say that Jesus was a Hellenized Jew or a radical reformer or anything like that based on these conflicting texts, when you could say that these few texts are among those that bubbled to the top out of the seething mass of uncoordinated myths and traditions flying around a cosmopolitan empire? That is to say, why aren't more scholars throwing their arms in the air, shouting hallelujah, and jumping on the mythicist bandwagon? Well, John, that sort of came close to happening I guess about 25 years ago with Burton L. Mack's great book, A Myth of Innocence, Mark's Gospel and Christian Origins, which implicitly does set this out. He happens to think that there was a Galilean kingdom of God movement led by a cynic like Jesus, a sage with an attitude, but that's not the only root of Christianity in his view. And so it almost doesn't matter that he posits a historical Jesus. He admitted to me in a letter that he does imply and intend a multiple root origin for Christianity. And that's kind of what Bultmann and others said, the whole history of religion school, that even if you say there was a historical Jesus, he's just one of the factors that entered into Christianity, which is why Bultmann does not consider Jesus one of the voices in New Testament theology. In his great book, Theology of the New Testament, he has a chapter on Jesus as a presupposition for New Testament theology, but he really deals with Paul, John, and the Epistle to the Hebrews. I think Georg Werner Kümmel did the same thing. He believed there was a Jesus, but it almost doesn't matter. And if you just take the next step and say, well, there's really no reason to posit that this cynic sage Jesus existed either. He's probably just a compilation of a bunch of sayings by all kinds of cynics, whom he sounds like. It's almost a moot point. And so insofar as people are following Mack's approach, and there are a lot of people that do, I'd say they kind of have embraced it. I can't tell you what percentage of New Testament scholars would say that, but in a sense, the basic mythicist paradigm has gained quite a following. And it's interesting to see and to say that this is underlined by the fact that the question of whether there was a historical Jesus as one element in that Mulligan stew is peripheral. Jesus matters so little that whether he was a myth or a historical figure, really, who cares? So is that a triumph of mythicism or not? That's the kind of weird, slippery answer I'd have to give on that. Very good question. But when it comes, well, okay, one other thing. If it actually comes to saying, but do you think there was some kind of historical Jesus? Once you say, no, I think probably not, it's like an onion, you peel away all the layers and there's nothing in there, that starts making people nervous. And I think, personally, just an opinion, that has to do with two things. A kind of residual Christian theological conscience, a box people have trouble thinking outside of, New Testament scholars do, even if they're atheists. And I know Bart Ehrman might fit this. I'm no mind reader, but I don't really have him especially in mind. I know that's what you're going to say, right? But there are plenty of secular New Testament scholars. I think even there, they just have this residual feeling, well, there must have been a Jesus and he must have been a pretty good guy at least. But I think it is just an echo, a hangover of their perhaps lost Christian faith. And number two, since it is considered the consensus view, some people just find it hard to explore outside of that box. The parameters of plausible theories exclude that, and they feel like they're confusing emotionalism with theory and thinking, boy, I would be thought a nut if I were to espouse this, and therefore I shall not espouse it. I don't want to be considered a nut gets confused with I don't want to be a nut, right? That's crazy. I can't take that seriously. That's kind of what you think you're thinking when actually you're saying, I wouldn't want to be an outcast. This is just my speculation on what's going on in some scholars' minds, because otherwise I have a hard time seeing why they simply rule out the Christ myth theory. But just speculation, that's all. Okay, this is from Ed. Some Ed, I'm not sure who it is. Presumably it's not the horse. Wilbur. Well, okay, I'm not going to do that voice. You'd never understand the question. If you simply evaporate, this is about the seawater thing we talked about. Can salt lose its savor and so forth? And here's an interesting comment on that. If you simply evaporate seawater, you will get an impure salt. Modern methods employ a series of basins, the first two of which are to precipitate sulfate of lime from the brine. In ancient times, they used just one basin and gathered up the salt and lime together. Salt, of course, is water-soluble, but the lime is not. So if the salt was washed out of the lime, either by tea bag methods of cooking to purify the salt, to deceive a customer, or accidentally, you would be left with a white, grainy powder that had no savor. Salt that had lost its savor fit only to be thrown on the dung heap or trodden underfoot. And here's the most pertinent section of an article where he got this, I believe. I must have cut off the beginning. The bottom of the pond or reservoir must be laid out perfectly even. The soil must be clayey to retain the water and should be beaten hard and smooth. Its outline may be irregular, and its depth should be from 3 to 6 feet. Of course, its size must depend on the extent of the saline which is to be established. In this reservoir, the seawater deposits its sediments, becomes warmed by the sun's rays, and begins to evaporate. From this reservoir, the partially concentrated brine is led by a canal to a series of rectangular basins from 10 to 16 inches in depth. These basins are divided into a series of compartments by means of little cross banks, through which the brine flows successively in a slow current which can be regulated at pleasure. These basins should be carefully prepared like the reservoir so as to retain water. Here, by the action of the sun and wind, the water is rapidly evaporated and deposits a portion of its lime in the form of sulfate. When the concentrated brine marks 15 to 18 degrees of Bohm's hydrometer, I hope I'm saying that right, it deposits a considerable quantity of sulfate of lime, and when it marks 25 degrees, the whole of the lime is deposited. From basin number 1, the brine passes in like manner to another series of similar rectangular basins. larger and more shallow, but more carefully constructed. In these basins, the remainder of the sulfate of lime is deposited, and the evaporation is carried to such a point that the water becomes a saturated brine by the time it reaches the lower side of them. At this period, the volume of the concentrated brine is greatly diminished, and marking 25 degrees of Bohm's hydrometer is ready to be transferred to the salting tables. It goes on to tell how to remove the salt from the brine before other salts are deposited, for example, Epsom salt, but that does not concern us here. Well, interesting. Yeah, I have read commentators saying, how the heck do you make salt unsalty? I guess this answers that. Yeah. Thank you, Ed. Okay, I guess this is the last one I'm going to do today. JJ. Let's see. I'm curious about the role of John the Baptist in the Gospels. For one, why does every Gospel include a John the Baptist story near the beginning in which Jesus is baptized and John testifies about Jesus' power and authority? Was John widely known and respected at the time, such that his testimony about Jesus would help to convince readers all around the Mediterranean to believe in Jesus? If John wasn't widely known to readers, what would be the point of kicking off every Gospel with a tale about him? Yeah, that is pretty interesting. One thing you've oversimplified a bit, the Gospel of John does not have John the Baptist baptize Jesus, but he does testify him to the crowd and say he's seen the Spirit descend upon him. In Mark and Luke, John does baptize Jesus, but does not testify to him. We're not really even told he knows who Jesus is. And in Matthew, he does baptize him, and though he doesn't speak of him to the crowd, he speaks to him and knows who he is. So they're all rather different. And the Gospel of the Ebionites has a John the Baptist story. Apparently, he was reasonably well known. There was a sect of John the Baptist who were probably the same as today's Mandeans. And so he could well have been known far and wide. I'm not sure how well we know that. I mean, if it's like a Jewish sectarian tempest in a teapot, you do have to wonder if those audiences at which the Gospels were aimed could be expected to know who the guy was. That is a very interesting conundrum. But presumably they figured he would be a good credential, that it would sort of be like Elijah handing on the mantle to Elisha or Moses to Joshua. And one of the items on the Christian gospel agenda was to co-opt John because his sect was a competing movement, and they're trying to co-opt John and his movement. Oh, your guy's okay, but he's not number one. He's really a front man for our guy, so why don't you come aboard? Okay, JJ says, I'm also interested in the story about John sending his disciple to Jesus to ask, are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another? Occurs in both Matthew 11 and Luke 7. Jesus answers, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me. Matthew 11, 4-6. Jesus follows up this question by asking the crowds about John using comparisons that mystify me. What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it was written, See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Matthew 11, 7 through 11. To me, the most obvious interpretation of this story is that John no longer has faith in Jesus as the Messiah sent by God to redeem Israel. In response, Jesus criticizes John for taking offense at him and says that John is excluded from the heavenly kingdom. Are there any other ways to interpret this story? What does it mean that Jesus compares John to a reed shaken by the wind and to a person dressed in soft robes? Why is John considered a saint in many traditions if he clearly lacked faith in Jesus? I grew up in the Unification Church headed up by Reverend Sun Myung Moon. My parents had an arranged marriage from Moon and participated in one of Moon's mass weddings. Yeah, I've been present at a couple of those. I left the church years ago, but one of Moon's teachings that has stuck with me is Moon's idea that if John the Baptist had been more devoted to Jesus, Jesus' messianic mission might have looked very different, and that Jesus was deeply grieved at John's lack of faith. What do you think? Well, I naturally go with David Friedrich Strauss on this. Strauss, I believe it, that settles it. He said that, wait a second, let's divide up the sources here. Let's see here, this is a Q saying, right? And that John the Baptist is languishing in prison. He hears of the deeds of Jesus, and he sends his disciples to ask him, are you the one we've been waiting for? Or if not, should we keep looking for somebody else? Strauss said it would be exceedingly weird for John to hear that some guy is doing miracles and he begins to doubt that he's the Messiah. That's what you're stuck with if you say, oh yeah, those stories are historical. John knew who Jesus was and endorsed him publicly. I'm John the Baptist and I approve of this commercial. You mean he's losing faith because of Jesus' miracles? That doesn't sound too likely. Keep in mind that in Luke, he is not said to know who Jesus is, and this despite this thing that Luke concocts making Jesus and John cousins. Presumably, even if that were true, which it's not, John wouldn't have known him because he grows up in the desert, right? And so in Luke, John doesn't know who Jesus is, and the first he hears of him, I mean, yeah, he baptizes him, but he baptizes thousands of people. He doesn't know them all, and he doesn't put them on a computerized email list or something. And so when he first hears of Jesus doing miracles, maybe this is the guy. And of course, maybe he feels like if it is, perhaps he will be delivered. We just have to guess that. It doesn't really say. Matthew he's the one that creates a problem, because for him, John did know who Jesus was, that he was the Messiah. Remember, what are you doing coming to me to be baptized? If anything, I should be coming to you, right? As permit it now, and so on and so on. Obviously, a kind of an ad hoc addition to the gospel to evade the embarrassment of who was whose guru here. John was the master of your guy, so I guess John is the Messiah, not your pal, right? They're trying to deal with that, and so he adds this little tete-a-tete between John and Jesus, which makes it embarrassing once he gets to that Q passage of John in prison, hearing of the deeds of the Christ, Luke says, and says, could this be the guy? Again, so you have to say, wait a minute, he already knew Jesus was the Messiah. How is it that the idea is now occurring to him? Oh, well, maybe he did believe he was the Messiah, but since the end of the age hadn't happened, and here he is with his keister stuck in a dungeon, that he's saying, well, maybe I was wrong. But that just doesn't work, because hearing the miraculous deeds of this guy is not going to prompt him to doubt. And so it's just one of Matthew's discontinuities, not the only one. But that forced people to say, well, I guess that's what happened. And then, of course, it does say, blessed is he who is not offended at me. But, of course, that doesn't mean that John was. Right? This is rhetoric aimed at the reader. You see? John asks if I'm the one and I've done these miracles. Go tell John what you see and hear. Well, you see him, reader. And this is why we're not told what John decided. We don't hear what he might have said when his disciples came back to him, right, with Jesus' answer. Why on earth not? Because it's open-ended. The point is, it's up to you now, reader. It's just like why Luke doesn't tell us whether the elder son heeded the advice of his father to bury the hatchet and greet the prodigal, right? We're not told because it's in your court now, reader. Or if you're a Jewish Christian and you're bristling at the idea of these latecomer pagans joining the church, you better think twice about that. Are you going to be less forgiving than God? It's up to you. That's why we're not told what the rich young ruler did, because it's aimed at you. What would you do? What are you going to do? And so I think that's what's going on. There's no real historical basis to any of that, but certainly it doesn't mean to say that John lost a faith he once had. By the way, Reverend Moon had a number of fascinating midrashic additions to the Gospels and behind-the-scenes explanations of things, which I don't think have any historical value, but then again, I think that about the Gospels anyway. But I've always been fascinated by Reverend Moon and the Unification Church. I have friends who teach at their seminary. I have taught at their seminary. I've much enjoyed meeting some of their grad students over the years. And I volunteered to write a Unificationist gospel. Astonishingly, they had never done it. And I said, look, your book, The Divine Principle, reads like an auto repair manual. It's dry as dust. What you need to attract people is, one of the professors saying, why don't we attract more people? And I said, what you need is a compelling, alluring gospel narrative based on all these midrashic additions by Reverend Moon. So I wrote it, and I published it in the Journal of Unification Studies. I guess it's not that easy to find, but it was really a lot of fun and gave me insight as to how the gospel writers of the Bible must have worked. But yeah, you have a unique position and even a privilege having grown up in that church. I understand you don't buy it, and nor do I. I'm just fascinated by it. But you have, this is like Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha. This has got to give you a unique perspective on religion and a lot of things. I think in many ways you're lucky to have gone through that experience, JJ. I guess I'll leave it at that. I'll be back with you when I get home from the Necronomicon, and that's what I go to instead of the Society of Biblical Literature meeting. And I'll see you then. So thanks for being with me on this exciting episode of The Bible Geek.